Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most uncomfortable intimate rituals, the Roman wedding night, a ceremony so carefully choreographed, so publicly scrutinized, and so fundamentally stripped of privacy that you'll wonder how anyone managed romance at all. Picture this: you're a young Roman, freshly married, escorted by torch, bearing attendants through the streets while flute players screech at volumes designed to drown out literally everything happening behind closed doors. Your bedroom isn't your own tonight. It's a state affair. Senators' wives are comparing notes tomorrow. Your mother-in-law may literally be stationed outside, listening. Your bride, who you might have met for the first time today, is being inspected by matrons with the clinical eye of a livestock appraiser. And here's the thing nobody tells you: this wasn't some fringe, whispered depravity. This was Rome's official, legally enshrined approach to one of humanity's most private moments. You probably won't survive this without questioning everything you thought you knew about ancient civilization's sophistication. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and what time it is where you are. I'm genuinely curious what time zone you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer territory, it conquered the intimate corners of human existence. For them, your wedding night wasn't a private milestone. It was a legal, social, and religious obligation hemmed in by rules that would make a modern bureaucrat weep with envy. What we're exploring tonight is how Rome systematized something that should resist systematization. And yes, there's something darkly fascinating about a civilization advanced enough to build aqueducts and concrete domes, yet primitive enough to treat bedroom consummation like a public health inspection. One mainstream historical fact anchors all of this: Roman law, particularly the codes that crystallized during the Republic and early Empire, made marriage a contractual property transfer between families. Your bride came with a dowry. The groom's family gained legal rights to her labor, her property, and her reproductive capacity. This wasn't love. This was economics in a toga. Here's a quirky detail that most people miss. Roman wedding attire included something called a tunica recta, a straight-cut linen tunic worn by the bride, often dyed with expensive saffron and topped with an elaborate veil system. The veil alone, called a flammeum, was so iconic, so specifically associated with legitimate marriage, that wearing one without being married could get you branded as dangerously presumptuous. Historians still argue whether the specific shade of saffron yellow held superstitious meaning, fertility magic, divine blessing, or simply wealth display. But the visual message was unmistakable: this woman is now transferred property. The wedding night itself was the moment when that transfer became irrevocable. Once you consummated the marriage, you had consummated a legal contract. There was no backing out without public scandal, and Rome was obsessed with making sure everyone knew you'd actually done it. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were its marriage rules. You're stepping back now into the Republic's earliest legal frameworks, where Romans were still figuring out how to turn the messiness of human bonding into something orderly, codifiable, and, most importantly, profitable. The path to your wedding night actually began centuries before you were born, in dusty forums where magistrates debated whether marriage should be a sine manu arrangement, without the husband's complete ownership, or cum manu, with it. These Latin distinctions sound academic, but they determined whether your bride's property remained technically hers or became your family's asset. They determined whether she could divorce you or whether that decision belonged entirely to your father. They determined, in a very real sense, who owned the person you were about to invite into your bedroom. The early Romans had inherited some traditions from the Etruscans before them, a people, incidentally, who gave women slightly more legal autonomy, which the prudish Romans found absolutely scandalous. But the Republic's legal architects wanted to build something different: a system where the household domus was a miniature state, with the father figure paterfamilias as absolute sovereign. Marriage was the mechanism that populated and extended this domestic empire. Every wedding was a small act of state building. By the time of the late Republic, say the 1st century BCE, the legal machinery was well oiled. There were technically different types of marriage, each with slightly different implications. Conferratio was the solemn, religious ceremony involving spelt cake and a priest of Jupiter, reserved for patricians and those seeking to make a real statement. Coemptio was essentially a mock sale, where the groom purchased the bride in front of witnesses, theater designed to cement proprietary rights. And usus, the sneakier option, was marriage by cohabitation. If you lived with a woman for a year without her explicitly refusing you 3 nights annually, boom, you were married. She was yours, no ceremony required. A mainstream historical fact that historians reliably confirm Roman law, especially under the Principate, the imperial system, standardized marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though consummation was theoretically deferred until the girl reached physical maturity. Theoretically, the gap between law and practice in Rome was sometimes as wide as the Mediterranean. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Rome's bizarre priorities. The wedding ceremony itself had no fixed religious officiant in early law. A priest might bless it or might not. The real religious moment came after consummation, when the bride made an offering to the household gods, the penates and lares, formally becoming a member of her husband's family cult. Until that happened, she was still, in some sense, her father's spiritual property. The bedroom was the conversion point. Historians still argue about how uniformly these rules were enforced across Rome's vast, diverse territories. Did agricultural provinces follow the same marriage protocols as urban Rome? Were there regional variations that the surviving written law simply doesn't capture? The evidence is frustratingly thin, which is why scholars divide into camps. Some argue for surprising consistency, others for substantial local variation hidden behind the official facade. The real genius and horror of the Roman legal system was that it made the private public. Your bedroom became a place where law, property, religion, and state interest all converged. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the product of centuries of legislative tinkering. Each generation of senators and legal minds refining the machinery, making it tighter, more binding, more inescapable. And by the time you're standing at your wedding threshold, that machinery was so ingrained, so normalized, that it felt like natural law rather than constructed oppression. The paterfamilias owned everything, including you. Let that sink in as you imagine yourself in this world. You're not just living under a roof. You're living under absolute paternal sovereignty that makes modern parental authority look like gentle suggestion. The paterfamilias, literally the father of the family, held patria potestas, a legal power so sweeping that it included the right to kill any member of his household without trial, to sell his children into slavery, to dissolve marriages, and to dictate every significant decision his wife and children would ever make. This wasn't theoretical. Roman law explicitly granted these powers, and while enforcement varied, the principle was ironclad. Now, here's where your wedding night becomes genuinely unsettling. You might be marrying a woman whose legal authority has been transferred from one paterfamilias to another. If it's a cum manu marriage, she's essentially moved from being her father's property to being yours, or more precisely, your father's property. Because if your father is still alive, he's your family's paterfamilias, and she answers to him first, even if it's a sine manu marriage, where technically her property remains separate and she maintains some nominal independence. She's still legally subordinate to you in the household hierarchy. She can't make contracts without your consent. She can't own property in her own name without complex legal workarounds. She can't divorce you without your approval in most circumstances. And when you take her to the bedroom tonight, you're exercising rights that the law has explicitly granted you over her body. The bedroom rituals you're about to experience aren't random theater. They're the culmination of a legal system that has stripped your bride of agency and converted her into a dependent. The witnesses outside your door, the matrons inspecting her the next morning, the family members stationed nearby, they're not just cultural curiosities. They're legal functionaries, ensuring that property transfer is complete and irreversible. A mainstream historical fact that's been extensively documented. The patria potestas actually weakened over time, particularly during the imperial period. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, emperors began passing legislation that limited a father's absolute power, recognizing, apparently, that even Rome's rigid society found the system occasionally grotesque. But this weakening happened slowly, unevenly, and often incompletely. In many households, particularly rural ones and among the lower classes where written law penetrated less deeply, the paterfamilias remained an absolute monarch well into the Christian era. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates the system's absurdity. If a paterfamilias wanted to punish his wife for infidelity, he could, in theory, kill her without legal consequence. But if he allowed her to commit adultery without punishing her, he could be prosecuted himself for lenocinium, essentially pimping out his wife. So the law didn't just grant him power, it obligated him to exercise it. Your wife's fidelity wasn't just a moral matter. It was your legal responsibility, and failing to police it made you complicit. Historians still argue whether the most extreme versions of patria potestas, the killing rights, the slavery rights, were actually invoked with any frequency, or whether they functioned primarily as theoretical background authority that hung over the household like an invisible sword. Livy records instances of fathers executing sons, and Suetonius describes Augustus's disgust at fathers who killed their children, suggesting it happened. But most legal historians suspect these were rare exceptions that generated outrage precisely because they violated customary practice, even if they didn't technically violate written law. The point is this: when you're escorted to your bedroom tonight, you're not just consummating a marriage. You're activating a legal structure that grants you sweeping authority over another person. The rituals that follow, the inspection, the witness, the public confirmation, they're all designed to make that transfer of power official, irreversible, and socially endorsed. Your bride entered this bedroom as a legal minor, regardless of her age, and by the time morning comes, she'll be legally bound to you in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. Betrothal wasn't a proposal, it was a contract, and you're discovering now that the romance you might have imagined simply wasn't part of the equation. When a Roman family decided you were getting married, negotiations happened between fathers or between the groom's family and the bride's family. Money changed hands, property was discussed. The bride herself might have been present, but her presence was largely ceremonial. She was being introduced to the terms of her own transfer, not consulted about whether she wanted it. The sponsalia, the betrothal ceremony, was a legally binding agreement that could only be dissolved under specific circumstances, and dissolution came with penalties. You were betrothed in front of witnesses. A contract was often drawn up, specifying the dowry the bride's family would provide, the gifts the groom's family would give, and the terms of the marriage itself. This was as formal and legally rigorous as any business transaction Rome conducted, because that's exactly what it was, a business transaction. Love, if it developed, was a fortunate accident. It was not the foundation of the arrangement. The scary part, the part that should make you deeply uncomfortable, is that you might have been betrothed as a child. Roman law didn't prohibit betrothals of very young children, though consummation was theoretically deferred. A girl betrothed at age 6 was still legally betrothed, her fate determined, her future mapped out by adults making financial calculations. She would grow up knowing she belonged to someone else, someone she'd never met, someone whose family had purchased her reproductive capacity and labor for a predetermined price. The betrothal ceremony itself varied in formality depending on the social class of the families involved. For patricians, the aristocratic elite, it was elaborate and religiously sanctioned. For plebeians and the lower classes, it might be simpler, but the legal effect was identical. Once betrothed, you couldn't simply change your mind. Breaking a betrothal required either mutual consent, very rare, or grounds recognized by law, and those grounds were limited. If the other party committed certain crimes, if they were discovered to have a serious disease, if they violated the terms of the betrothal contract itself, then perhaps you could escape. But casual dissolution, the kind of thing a modern person might do by text message, was essentially impossible. A mainstream historical fact that legal historians emphasize Roman betrothal law included specific penalties for breach of contract. If you betrothed someone, and then refused to marry them without legitimate cause, you could face financial penalties, and your reputation would suffer public damage. The system was designed to be binding, to prevent the kind of casual relationship shopping that modern dating permits. Once you committed, Rome's legal machinery ensured you'd follow through. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the system's peculiar logic. A betrothed woman was legally forbidden to marry anyone else, but she wasn't yet legally married. This created a liminal status where she had lost her freedom without gaining the legal protections of actual marriage. If something happened to her, assault, for instance, the legal recourse was murky. She was bound to a man she wasn't yet married to, which meant she wasn't entirely her father's property anymore, but she wasn't quite her betrothed's either. She existed in a legal gray zone, which is exactly where Rome wanted to keep women unclear about their own status, dependent on male interpretation of their position. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of these betrothals on young girls, and more broadly on Roman marriage culture. Some scholars suggest that the legal binding created a kind of desensitization, that girls raised knowing their fate was sealed simply accepted it as normal. Others argue that the evidence is too sparse to make grand claims about emotional experience, that we're projecting modern assumptions onto people whose internal lives we simply can't access. What's not argued, though, is the legal fact betrothal was binding. It often involved children, and it stripped the betrothed person of agency in shaping their own future. And here's the thing: your wedding night, when it finally arrives, isn't the beginning of your marriage. It's the consummation of a contract that's been legally binding for years, possibly since you were both children. The bedroom isn't where the commitment begins. It's where the commitment is finally, physically, irrevocably sealed. Child brides and the uncomfortable age question. You need to confront this directly because it's the foundation of everything that happens in the bedroom tonight. Roman law, in its cold legal precision, set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. 12. Let that number sit with you for a moment. A girl who hasn't even begun menstruating in many cases, whose body is nowhere near ready for pregnancy, whose mind is still forming, was legally marriageable. The law didn't forbid consummation at that age either, though there was a theoretical acknowledgement that it might be inadvisable. The question historians have wrestled with for centuries is simple but impossible to answer definitively. How common was it, actually, for Roman families to consummate marriages with 12-year-old girls? The evidence is maddeningly sparse. We have legal codes saying it was permitted. We have scattered references in literature and medical texts suggesting it happened. The physician Soranus, writing in the 2nd century CE, actually advised against consummating marriages with very young girls, suggesting that some people were doing exactly that, and he felt compelled to warn against it. But how widespread was the practice? Was it common among the wealthy elite, who had the luxury of following every legal rule? Was it rarer among the middle and lower classes, where practical concerns about a girl's physical capacity to survive pregnancy might have created informal age raising? We simply don't know. What we do know is that marriages between significantly older men and adolescent girls were definitely happening. A 40-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl was entirely legal, entirely socially acceptable, and apparently not uncommon, particularly among the aristocracy where political and financial alliances depended on these unions. The bride's youth actually worked in the groom's favor. She was more malleable, more easily shaped into the role her husband's family required, less likely to have developed independent opinions or expectations. A mainstream historical fact that's been thoroughly documented. Even though the legal minimum age was 12 for girls, many families delayed actual consummation until the bride was slightly older, perhaps 16 or 18. This suggests that Romans themselves recognized that there was a difference between what the law permitted and what was practically or medically advisable. But the key word is many, not all. And in a legal system where the law explicitly permitted it, there was no mechanism to prevent fathers from marrying off their 12-year-old daughters or from allowing their adult sons to consummate those marriages immediately. Here's a quirky detail that historians rarely emphasize. Roman medical writers developed entire frameworks for assessing whether a young girl was physically ready for marriage. They discussed menstrual cycles, physical development, the capacity of the reproductive tract to accommodate intercourse without tearing. The very existence of this medical literature suggests that consummation of marriages with very young girls was common enough that doctors felt obligated to offer guidance on how to do it safely. The fact that they were offering this guidance is horrifying to modern sensibilities, but it's also evidence that the practice was real. Historians still argue vehemently about what the social reality was versus what the law permitted. Some scholars argue that the legal minimum of 12 was almost never used, that practical considerations meant marriages were typically consummated when girls were older. Others point to the medical literature and scattered references as evidence that consummation of child marriages definitely happened, even if we can't quantify how often. The debate isn't settled because the evidence won't allow settlement. But here's what matters for understanding your wedding night. You're walking into a legal and social framework where the bride beside you might be barely an adolescent, where there's absolutely nothing illegal about what you're about to do, where witnesses will be stationed to ensure it happens, and where the next morning there will be an inspection to confirm it did. If she's young, genuinely young, that doesn't make you a deviant in Roman eyes. It makes you a law-abiding citizen exercising your legal rights. The rituals that follow your bedroom door closing aren't protecting her. They're ensuring that whatever happens to her, it happens with full legal sanction and social approval. The attendants who escorted you to bed were more than just ceremonial witnesses. They were functionaries in a ritual that transformed the private into the public, and they took their role with surprising seriousness. Picture the scene: your wedding feast is winding down. You've drunk enough wine that the room's already slightly blurred. Suddenly, there's a shift in energy. The female attendants, matrons, often older women from both families, approach your bride. The male attendants, groomsmen, and senior family members approach you. And then begins the escorting ritual, the deductio in domum, the formal leading into the home ceremony that culminates at your bedroom door. These attendants aren't random guests. They're selected specifically for this role. The principal matron escorting your bride is often her mother or a close female relative, which adds an extra layer of awkwardness. Imagine your mother-in-law personally conducting you to the bedroom. The groomsmen escorting you include men of status, sometimes older family friends whose presence lends weight and authority to the proceedings. They're walking you through the streets. Yes, through the streets. With torches blazing, musicians playing, sometimes with other guests following behind in a procession. Your private moment is being publicly announced and celebrated. The whole point of this escorting is to establish witnesses. Roman law valued testimony from multiple people, and having multiple attendants present meant multiple people could later testify that the marriage was consummated. This wasn't about romance or celebration. It was about legal verification. The attendants are essentially serving as notaries for your intimate moment. When you reach the bedroom door, the attendant's role becomes even more specific. They don't just leave. They ensure you enter. They might offer advice, ribald jokes, encouragement, sometimes surprisingly practical guidance about what's about to happen. For a young bride who's never experienced sexual contact, and possibly for a young groom who hasn't either, these attendants sometimes functioned as unexpected sex educators, offering commentary and direction. Then they station themselves outside the door, waiting for confirmation that consummation has occurred. Some sources suggest they might remain there throughout, listening for sounds that would confirm the act was taking place. A mainstream historical fact that's been extensively documented. The deductio ceremony was considered so important to the legal validity of marriage that some sources suggest a marriage wasn't technically complete until the bride had been formally escorted to the groom's house and the bedroom. The legal and ceremonial aspects were inseparable. You couldn't just slip away quietly with your bride. The public ritual had to happen, had to be witnessed, had to be done correctly. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the Roman obsession with procedure. There were apparently rules about how the bride should be carried or led to the bedroom. Some sources mention that it was considered proper for the groom to carry the bride across the threshold, a practice that persists in modern wedding tradition, though few people know its origin. Other sources describe the bride being led by attendants, with the groom following behind. The specific choreography might seem trivial, but Romans cared deeply about doing things the right way. Doing it wrong could potentially undermine the marriage's legal validity. Historians still argue about how literally to interpret the most detailed accounts of these escort ceremonies. Some of the most vivid descriptions come from literary sources. Catullus's wedding poems, for instance, which might be exaggerating for poetic effect. Were these ceremonies really as elaborate, as publicly theatrical as the literary sources suggest? Or are we reading dramatic descriptions and assuming they represent common practice? The archaeological evidence is frustratingly silent on this point. We have no wedding night records, no legal documents describing the specific procedures. We're mostly relying on poetry and occasional references in medical or legal texts. What's clear is that you didn't have privacy. The attendants made sure of that. They transformed your bedroom into a semi-public space, a place where your actions were being monitored, anticipated, and would later be reported on. And when they finally closed the door and stationed themselves outside, they weren't leaving you alone. They were waiting for sounds, for movements, for the confirmation that would make their witness testimony meaningful tomorrow. The flute players drowning out your shame, because that's really what they were doing, even if Rome called it something else. Outside your bedroom door, musicians are positioned specifically to make noise, loud noise. The instruments of choice are the aulos and the tibia, ancient double, reed woodwinds and flutes that produce high, piercing, almost harsh sounds that modern ears would find genuinely unpleasant. They're playing continuously, loudly enough that the sounds from inside your bedroom, gasps, cries, the physical sounds of sexual activity, are masked beneath layers of musical noise. This detail is so revealing about Roman attitudes towards sex that it's worth sitting with for a moment. Rome simultaneously wanted your wedding night to happen, wanted it to be witnessed legally, wanted it to be confirmed the next morning through inspection, and yet didn't want to actually hear it. The flute music is cognitive dissonance made audible. It's Rome saying, yes, we demand this happen. No, we don't want to know what it actually sounds like. Drown it out. The specific volumes these instruments could produce is worth considering. A single aulos is already loud and penetrating. Multiple musicians playing together could create a sound level that would genuinely mask most normal human vocalizations. This wasn't accidental. Roman hosts hired musicians specifically for this purpose, to provide auditory privacy while maintaining visual and legal surveillance. You could be screaming in pain or panic, and the attendants outside would hear only flutes. There's something almost darkly comic about the practice, except it's not comic at all when you realize what it implies. The music isn't there because Romans were prudes who didn't want to hear sex. They were perfectly comfortable with sexuality in other contexts. Brothels were openly tolerated, erotic art decorated homes, sexual jokes were common in public spaces. The music was there because wedding nights specifically, consummation specifically, needed to be acoustically hidden even while being legally verified. The act itself needed to remain private, even as its occurrence needed to be public knowledge. A mainstream historical fact that's well documented. The musicians hired for wedding ceremonies were typically professional musicians, the same people who performed at banquets and festivals. They would have understood their role completely. Some sources describe them being hired specifically because of their ability to play loudly and persistently. There's even evidence suggesting that particularly good wedding musicians, those who could reliably create enough noise to thoroughly mask bedroom sounds, were in high demand and could command premium fees. Here's a quirky detail that most people miss: the type of music played sometimes had specific thematic meaning. Certain melodies or musical styles were associated with fertility, with blessing, with divine favor. So the noise wasn't random. It had ceremonial significance. The flute players weren't just creating acoustic camouflage. They were invocation and blessing wrapped in uncomfortable cacophony. The louder and more obnoxious the music, the more powerfully, it was believed to invoke fertility and bless the union. Historians still argue about the psychological experience this created for the people involved. Was the noise comforting to a terrified bride, knowing that her pain or fear wouldn't be heard by the attendants and family members stationed outside? Or was it terrifying, a reminder that she was being acoustically isolated, that no one could hear her if she needed help? Did the groom find the noise reassuring or emasculating, a reminder that his intimate moment was being orchestrated and managed by other people? The sources don't tell us how people felt. They tell us what happened, not how it was experienced. What we can say with certainty is that you're about to experience sex. For the first time, possibly, with a team of musicians outside your door, creating a wall of sound specifically designed to prevent anyone from hearing what's happening. It's one of Rome's more bizarre contributions to human ritual technology deployed not to enhance intimacy, but to create a peculiar form of privacy that's actually the complete opposite of privacy. You're alone with your bride, technically, but you're not alone at all. You're performing for people you can't see, in front of people you can't hear, under conditions orchestrated by people who have no interest in your actual experience. Brides in white. The ritual you thought was modern actually has Roman roots stretching back 2 millennia, which means every white wedding you've ever seen carries the DNA of Roman imperial ceremony. The bride standing next to you is wearing a distinctive outfit that would have been immediately recognizable across the Roman world as a wedding bride, and the visual system is surprisingly elaborate once you understand what each element signifies. Start with the tunic. It's called a tunica recta, literally a straight tunic, and it's specifically cut and constructed for wedding ceremonies. It's not the everyday wear of a Roman woman. It's ceremonial, formal, and importantly, it's new. A bride typically wore a tunic that had been woven specifically for her wedding, often by female relatives as a kind of final gift before her transfer to her husband's family. The tunic itself is typically white or off, white linen, though for wealthy brides, saffron yellow dye was sometimes used, a color associated with fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. Saffron was expensive, so the color itself was a status display, a way for the bride's family to show they could afford the best for this important transaction. But the tunic is just the foundation. Over it comes the palla, a large rectangular shawl draped in a specific way that only married women, or brides, could wear. And then comes the veil, the flammium, which gives the whole ensemble its visual identity. This veil is typically a deep yellow or orange-red. The color is important because it's called flame-colored, and it's believed to have protective and fertility-inducing properties. The veil isn't small or demure. It's large enough to cover most of the bride's head and shoulders, and it's constructed from expensive fabric. For wealthy brides, it might be adorned with gold thread or jewels. The veil system is so specifically associated with legitimate marriage that the law actually intervenes. There are references to women being punished or publicly shamed for wearing wedding veils without actually being married. The veil isn't just clothing, it's a legal declaration. You're wearing it because you're being transferred from one family's authority to another's, and the veil makes that transfer visually obvious to everyone who sees you. A mainstream historical fact that's extensively documented, the bridal veil, the flammium, persists in modern wedding tradition, though most modern brides don't know its origin. The white wedding dress as we know it is actually a Victorian invention, popularized by Queen Victoria, but the concept of a distinctive bridal veil is directly descended from Roman practice. The veil carries the same symbolic weight it did 2,000 years ago. It marks the wearer as a bride, as someone transitioning into marriage, as someone whose status is changing. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Roman superstition. The knot tying the bride's palla together, called the nodus Herculaneus, the Herculean knot, was believed to have fertility magic. The groom would literally untie this knot during the wedding night, and the untying itself was considered symbolically important. It's not just removing clothing, it's undoing magical knots. Some sources suggest that if the knot was particularly difficult to untie, it was interpreted as a sign that fertility magic was particularly strong. If it came undone too easily, it might suggest weak magic or bad omens. So here's this strange moment where you're fumbling with your bride's clothing, and both of you are possibly aware that how easily the knot comes undone is being interpreted by superstitious witnesses as magical commentary on your union. Historians still argue about whether the saffron yellow color was universal or if it varied by region, social class, or time period. Some scholarly sources describe brides consistently wearing saffron-colored clothing and veils. Others suggest that the color might have been more variable, that wealthier brides might have used more expensive dyes while poorer brides used cheaper alternatives. The literary sources emphasize the yellow, orange color so consistently that it's probably safe to assume it was the ideal, even if not everyone achieved it. What matters is that your bride isn't arriving in neutral clothing. She's arriving in a costume that announces her status, her transition, her transfer. The veil especially, that flame-colored fabric covering her head, is a legal and magical declaration. She's no longer her father's daughter. She's your wife. The clothing makes it official before the consummation even begins. The torch ceremony and its unsettling symbolism. You're standing now in the procession moving through the streets, and torches are everywhere. They're not there for practical illumination, though that's part of it. They're there for religious significance, for magical protection, and for announcing to the entire city that a wedding is happening right now. Multiple torch bearers walk ahead of the bride, lighting the path. Other torch bearers flank the procession. Some sources describe torch bearers specifically stationed at the bride's family home, then transferred to the groom's family home, a literal passing of flame that represents the transfer of the bride herself. The torch has deep religious meaning in Roman culture. It's associated with Hymen, the god of weddings, and with Hecate, a goddess of boundaries and transitions. Torches mark sacred spaces and sacred moments. They protect against malevolent spirits, which Romans believed genuinely haunted transitions and liminal spaces like weddings. A bride moving from one household to another is in a spiritually vulnerable position, crossing a threshold between her old identity and her new one. The torches are spiritual protection, creating a consecrated space around the procession that keeps evil away. But the torches also serve a deeply practical purpose. They're announcing. The procession is loud, it's visible, it's impossible to miss. Everyone in the neighborhood knows a wedding is happening. Everyone will know that the bride has been transferred to the groom's house. Everyone will know that the couple has gone to the bedroom. There are no secrets. The whole community becomes, in a sense, witness to the event. The torches make sure of that. The journey from the bride's family home to the groom's family home is ceremonial and deliberate. It's not a quick trip. It's a procession, often moving slowly through the streets with musicians playing and guests following along. The bride is being displayed, paraded, publicly transferred, and the torches light the entire journey, making sure everyone sees it. For a woman who's spent her life in relative domestic confinement, Roman women of respectable families didn't move freely through public spaces. This procession might be one of the most public moments of her life. A mainstream historical fact that's well established, the torch ceremony was considered essential to the legal validity of the marriage. Some legal sources suggest that a marriage conducted without the torch procession might not be considered legitimate. The ceremony itself wasn't just decoration. It was a required element of proper marriage procedure. Skipping it could potentially create legal complications later, which is why even modest families tried to conduct at least some version of the torch ceremony. Here's a quirky detail that historians often overlook: the specific source of the torch fire mattered. In some sources, the torches are described as being lit from the bride's family hearth, the sacred fire that represented her family's spiritual continuity. These flames from the old family home would then be carried to the new family home, where they would light a fire in the groom's family hearth. Its symbolic continuity made literal, the bride's family's spiritual essence is being transferred, carried in flame, to her new home. Whether this actually happened consistently, or whether it's literary embellishment, we can't say for certain. Historians still debate the extent to which ordinary Romans practiced these elaborate torch ceremonies versus how much was specific to wealthy, aristocratic marriages. Did a working class couple get torches? Did they process publicly through the streets? Did they invoke Hymen and Hecate? The evidence suggests that wealthier families conducted more elaborate versions of these ceremonies, but that some version of public procession probably happened across social classes. The specific details might vary, but the principle of public announcement and spiritual protection seems consistent. What's unsettling about the torch ceremony, when you really think about it, is that it's not celebrating the couple's union. It's announcing the bride's departure from one household and arrival at another. The torches aren't lighting a love story. They're illuminating a property transfer. The bride is being moved publicly, ceremonially, spiritually protected while being moved from one man's authority to another's. The torches make it official. The entire city is witnessing not a union, but a transition of ownership. Hymen, checking in the grim, proof of consummation. You've made it through the night. The bedroom door has finally closed on the witnesses and attendants. The flute players have stopped. You're alone with your bride. And now comes the part that most modern people don't realize happened tomorrow morning. There will be an inspection, an actual physical inspection designed to determine whether consummation occurred and whether your bride was a virgin before last night. The inspection happens in the morning after you've both emerged from the bedroom. Female matrons, senior women from both families, sometimes the groom's mother, sometimes a midwife or female physician, examine the bride. They're looking specifically for evidence of virginity lost blood on the bedding or on the bride's body, physical signs of tearing or damage to the hymen, visible signs that penetrative sex has occurred. This isn't metaphorical. This is a literal physical inspection of your bride's genitals conducted by multiple women with the understanding that the results will be reported to both families and potentially discussed publicly. The hymen itself carries an enormous cultural burden in Rome. It's treated as definitive proof of virginity, which is medically inaccurate then and now. Hymens can be damaged by non-sexual activity, can be absent naturally, can bleed or not bleed for any number of reasons. But Rome doesn't know this. Rome believes the hymen is a physical seal that only breaks during first intercourse, and that breaking it produces visible blood. The inspection is looking for that blood as proof. What happens if the inspection fails? If there's no blood, if the bride shows no obvious physical signs of virginity loss, depends on circumstances. In some cases, it might be dismissed as inconclusive. In others, it might trigger accusations of pre-marital infidelity. If the bride's family is wealthy and connected, they might be able to protect her with alternative explanations or political pressure. If she's from a less powerful family, if the groom's family is particularly rigid about these matters, the consequences could be severe, immediate divorce, return of the dowry, public humiliation, or worse. A mainstream historical fact that's extensively documented Roman law recognized a concept called actio reuxoria, essentially, a lawsuit regarding the bride's condition. If a groom discovered that his bride wasn't a virgin, he could potentially sue her family, claiming they'd misrepresented the product they'd sold him. The bride's father could face legal penalties for selling damaged goods, essentially. This wasn't a rare legal provision. It's documented across multiple legal sources and seems to have been taken seriously enough that families went to considerable lengths to either ensure or at least credibly claim their daughter's virginity. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the absurdity of the system. There are medical texts from Roman physicians discussing how to fake virginity, how to artificially produce blood, how to tighten the vagina temporarily, how to deceive the inspecting matrons. The very existence of these texts suggests that the pressure to appear virginal was so intense that some people were actively seeking ways to circumvent the inspection. And if physicians were writing guides on deception, that implies the deception was actually happening, that brides or their families were desperate enough to risk it. Historians still argue about how literally to take the most dramatic accounts of these inspections. Were they really as invasive, as humiliating, as systematically conducted as some sources suggest, or are we reading exaggerated literary descriptions? The legal texts are clear that the concept existed and was legally significant. The question is whether the practice was as widespread and as rigorous as the literary sources make it sound. Some scholars argue that many marriages probably skipped the formal inspection, that it was an ideal more honored in the breach than in the observance. Others point out that the legal consequences for getting it wrong, for falsely representing virginity, were severe enough that families probably did conduct the inspections carefully. What's undeniable is that you're standing in a bedroom tonight knowing that tomorrow morning your bride will be physically examined by other women. They'll be looking at her body for evidence of what you did to her. She knows this too. The knowledge shapes the entire experience. She's not just experiencing consummation. She's experiencing consummation while aware that her body will be inspected and judged tomorrow. She's experiencing the pressure to bleed, to show visible signs of damage, to provide evidence that will satisfy the matrons and protect her from accusations of pre-marital infidelity. What happened if she failed the test? Because that's the question that hangs over everything, isn't it? The inspection happens. The matrons emerge, and they announce their findings. If there's blood, if there are visible signs of virginity loss, everyone can move forward with the assumption that the bride was indeed a virgin and that consummation has been completed. The marriage is fully valid. The property transfer is irreversible. Life continues. But if there's no blood, if the hymen appears intact, if the bride shows no visible signs of penetrative intercourse, then you have a crisis. And the consequences depend on several factors: the political and financial power of the families involved, the groom's willingness to accept alternative explanations, the bride's family's ability to defend her, and the broader social context of the specific moment. In the best-case scenario, the bride's family offers an explanation. Medical explanations were particularly popular. Perhaps the bride has a naturally thick or elastic hymen that doesn't tear easily. Perhaps she menstruated during the night, and that's why there's no blood from the virginity loss. The menstrual blood obscures everything. Perhaps she has some medical condition that prevents normal bleeding. If the groom's family accepts these explanations, particularly if the bride's family is wealthy and well, connected enough to make accepting the explanation politically wise, the matter might be dropped quietly. The marriage stands. Life continues, albeit with whispers and suspicions that will follow the bride forever. But in worse scenarios, the failed inspection triggers cascading consequences. The groom can claim he was defrauded. He didn't receive what he paid for. His bride isn't the virgin he was promised. He can demand return of the dowry, a financial blow to the bride's family. He can demand a divorce, which is socially humiliating for the bride and damaging to her family's reputation. More dramatically, he can publicly accuse the bride of pre-marital infidelity. This accusation, once made publicly, is almost impossible to fully escape, even if it's eventually disproven. The bride's reputation is permanently damaged. Her family's honor is questioned. And then there are the absolute worst cases, the ones that historians reference carefully and modern people struggle to comprehend. If a bride is publicly found to not be a virgin on her wedding night, if her infidelity is unambiguously proven by the inspection, the consequences could be severe. In the earliest period of Roman law, a husband had the legal right to execute an unfaithful wife. By the classical period, this extreme response had been somewhat limited, but the potential for violence or extreme punishment remained. A bride discovered to be non-virginal might face physical punishment, might be cast out from her husband's household in disgrace, might be forced into a marriage dissolution that leaves her stranded socially and economically. A mainstream historical fact that's thoroughly documented. The legal right to demand dowry return and to sue the bride's family for misrepresentation was real and was apparently exercised. There are references in legal texts to cases where grooms sued fathers-in-law for selling them non-virgin brides. The fact that legal codes specifically address this scenario suggests it happened often enough to require legislative attention. This wasn't theoretical. This was real legal action with real consequences for real families. Here's a quirky detail that historians find darkly fascinating. There are references in some sources to women using animal blood, chicken blood, pigeon blood, to fake the appearance of virginity loss. Some accounts describe elaborate preparations where a woman, knowing her hymen wouldn't produce visible bleeding, would prepare animal blood hidden in her body to be discovered during the inspection. If discovered, this deception would have catastrophic consequences. It would prove that she actively misrepresented her virginity, that she was not just non-virgin, but deceptive about it. But the very existence of these stories suggests that some women were desperate enough to attempt the deception, that the pressure to appear virginal was intense enough to drive people to extraordinary measures. Historians still argue about how often these failures actually happened and what the real consequences were. Some scholars suggest that most women probably did bleed during first intercourse, either from hymenal tearing or from other causes like menstruation coinciding with the wedding night, and that the inspection passed in most cases. Others argue that the obsession with the inspection in legal and literary sources suggests that failed inspections were common enough to be a genuine concern. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Most marriages probably passed inspection, but failures happened frequently enough that they shaped behavior, created anxiety, and occasionally triggered serious consequences. What matters for understanding your bride's experience is that she's going into this knowing about the inspection. She knows her body will be examined. She knows that visible signs of virginity loss are necessary to protect her. She's under profound pressure to bleed, to show damage, to provide the physical evidence that will declare her a legitimate virgin and make the marriage fully valid. If she doesn't bleed, even through no fault of her own, even if her body simply doesn't respond that way, she faces potential humiliation, accusation, and serious consequences. The curious case of the wedding night witness, and you're discovering now that witness might mean something far more literal than you initially understood. The attendants and family members stationed outside your bedroom door aren't just waiting passively. In some cases, particularly in literary accounts, they're actively listening. And in certain circumstances, particularly among some elite families where the stakes of proving consummation were highest, there's evidence that people were stationed to actually observe. The most explicit accounts come from literary sources, particularly from comedic or dramatic works, where the wedding night is depicted with dark humor. These accounts describe family members or attendants with their ears pressed against the door, listening intently for sounds of sexual activity. They describe people waiting for specific sounds, gasps, moans, physical movements that would confirm consummation was occurring. Some accounts describe people actually looking through cracks in the door or through gaps in the walls, trying to get visual confirmation of what was happening. These literary depictions might be exaggerated for comic effect, but they're describing something that apparently happened enough to be recognizable to the audience. Why would someone actually want to watch? The answer lies in the stakes. For a family concerned about legitimacy, about the validity of the marriage contract, about protecting themselves from future lawsuits or accusations, having direct eyewitness testimony wasn't just useful, it was valuable. If the groom later claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage, if he later claimed the bride was non-responsive, if he later claimed anything that might suggest the marriage was invalid, having multiple witnesses who could testify that they saw or heard consummation actually occurring would be powerful legal protection. For the bride, the prospect of being observed is perhaps even more disturbing. She's already losing her privacy to the inspection that will happen tomorrow. She's already aware that her body will be examined by matrons. But the idea that people might actually be watching her during consummation, watching her fear, watching her pain, watching her loss of virginity, is a violation that compounds every other violation of the evening. She has no legal recourse. She can't refuse. She can't demand privacy. She can only hope that the observers, if they're present, are at least partially obscured by darkness or distance. A mainstream historical fact that's documented in legal sources, the concept of consummation witnesses, appears in Roman legal discussions of marriage validity. If a marriage was later disputed, if either party claimed it hadn't been properly consummated, if they claimed the marriage should be considered invalid, legal sources discuss how witness testimony about consummation could be introduced as evidence. The existence of this legal framework suggests that having witnesses to consummation was considered normal enough that the law needed to establish rules about how their testimony would be treated. Here's a quirky detail that's genuinely unsettling. There are references in some sources to specific positions being preferred for wedding night consummation because they supposedly provided the best evidence of virginity loss, positions that maximize the likelihood of visible bleeding. The very fact that there's discussion of positioning for optimal evidence gathering suggests that people were genuinely concerned with ensuring that the physical signs of virginity loss would be visible and indisputable. The bride's experience isn't being optimized for her comfort or pleasure. It's being optimized for evidence production. Historians still argue fiercely about how literally to interpret the most extreme accounts. Were people actually watching? Were they actually observing visually, or just listening from outside the door? How common was this practice? Some scholars argue that the literary accounts are comedic exaggeration, that the extreme voyeurism described in plays and poems was not actually standard practice. Others point out that comedy often exaggerates real practices for comic effect, that the fact that watching wedding nights is funny in Roman comedy suggests it's a recognized behavior, even if not universally practiced. What seems likely is that the degree of surveillance varied. Some families probably did position observers literally at or near the door, listening intently for sounds of consummation. Others probably maintained observers at a distance, ready to testify if needed, but not actively eavesdropping throughout. Some families probably just waited outside the door without any particular focus on hearing or seeing what was happening. But across all of these variations, the bride and groom were never truly alone. They were never truly private. The wedding night was a semi-public performance, conducted in a bedroom but orchestrated and monitored by people outside that bedroom. And here's the final cruel detail. The bride often had no idea how closely she was being watched. She might assume the attendants outside were simply waiting. She might not realize that someone's ear was pressed against the door, listening. She might not understand that her sounds of pain or fear were being interpreted as confirmation of consummation. The surveillance itself became a form of violation that she might not even fully comprehend while it was happening. Aphrodisiacs, potions, and love magic. You're stepping now into the murkier territory of Roman wedding practices, where superstition, medicine, and outright sorcery blur together in ways that reveal a civilization simultaneously sophisticated and deeply superstitious. Because here's the thing, Rome had no reliable way to ensure sexual performance. A young groom might be nervous. A young bride might be terrified. Either condition could lead to difficulty with consummation, and both the bride's family and the groom's family had enormous incentive to ensure that consummation actually happened, that the marriage was fully valid, that no one could later claim the marriage was incomplete. Enter aphrodisiacs and love potions. These weren't marginal practices. They were common enough to warrant explicit discussion in medical texts, legal codes, and literary works. Physicians wrote about which herbs and substances could stimulate sexual arousal. Some of these recommendations were based on actual pharmacology. Substances like pepper, ginger, and certain wines do contain compounds that might genuinely affect blood flow or nervous system response. Others were pure superstitions: ground rhinoceros horn, crocodile testicles, substances whose efficacy was entirely psychological. The preparations were sometimes administered by the bride's family to the groom, ensuring he could perform. Sometimes they were given to the bride herself, either to calm her fear or to stimulate arousal. Sometimes both parties received preparations. The substances might be mixed into food or wine consumed during the wedding feast. The bride might consume something specifically prepared for her, something her mother or female relatives administered with the understanding that it would help her through the ordeal ahead. But beyond simple aphrodisiacs lay darker magic. Love magic, actual sorcery, conducted by people who claimed to manipulate the supernatural to ensure sexual arousal, sexual performance, or even sexual coercion. There's evidence in Roman sources of magical practitioners, often women, sometimes men, being hired to create binding spells that would force attraction or desire. These practitioners would create physical objects, poppets, small figurines, inscribed tablets, knotted cords, designed to magically compel the target person to respond sexually. The legal status of love magic was complicated. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was viewed with deep suspicion. There are references in legal sources to people being prosecuted for using love magic, not because the magic itself was illegal, but because the intent behind it, to manipulate someone without their consent, was considered harmful. But the fact that love magic was prosecuted suggests it was being practiced, and practiced commonly enough that legal authorities felt obligated to address it. A mainstream historical fact that's thoroughly documented. Roman physicians and medical writers, even respected ones, included aphrodisiacs in their medical recommendations. Galen, one of Rome's most famous physicians, discusses various substances that could stimulate sexual function. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, catalogs numerous aphrodisiacs alongside other medical information. These weren't fringe practitioners. These were mainstream medical authorities incorporating sexual performance enhancement into their medical philosophy. The fact that they took it seriously suggests it was considered a legitimate medical concern. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Roman superstition. There's evidence of people using what we'd call lucky objects, or charm objects, specifically for wedding nights. Small amulets or talismans designed to ensure sexual success, to protect against impotence, to guarantee fertility. These objects might be worn by the groom, or hidden in the wedding chamber, or given to the bride to wear. The exact mechanism by which these objects were supposed to work is often unclear. The magic was believed to operate in ways that modern people would call purely psychological, but Romans took it seriously enough to spend money on these objects. Historians still argue about how much of Rome's love magic should be understood as actual attempted sorcery versus how much should be understood as psychological manipulation. Essentially, placebos. A love potion that has no actual pharmacological effect, but that the recipient believes in might work through psychological mechanisms. If the groom believes the aphrodisiac will help him perform, his increased confidence might be enough to actually improve performance. If the bride believes a charm will protect her, her reduced anxiety might make the experience more bearable. The magic doesn't need to be real to be effective. What matters is that people, families, the bride, the groom, were actively trying to manipulate the wedding night through magical and pharmaceutical means. The wedding night wasn't something that happened naturally. It was something that was being engineered, managed, controlled through whatever means available. The bride might be consuming substances she doesn't fully understand. The groom might be relying on potions or magic to perform. Both parties might be surrounded by magical protections and manipulations, all designed to ensure that the wedding night proceeded according to plan. And here's the disturbing implication: if the bride is consuming aphrodisiacs or magical preparations, if she's being given substances to stimulate arousal, then her arousal isn't genuinely hers. It's being chemically or magically induced. Her consent, in a very real sense, has been chemically compromised. She's not responding to her own desires. She's responding to substances administered by her family, all in service of making the wedding night work. The groom's bizarre abduction ritual, and you're discovering now that your role in this ceremony is literally to kidnap your bride, to physically seize her from her mother's arms and carry her away. This isn't metaphorical. This is an actual physical act that's part of the wedding ceremony, choreographed and expected, laden with symbolic meaning that traces back to Rome's earliest mythological narratives. The ritual unfolds like this: as the wedding feast draws to a close, as the moment approaches to lead the bride to the bedroom, there's a formal abduction. The groom approaches the bride's mother, the woman who has raised this young woman, who is about to lose her to another family. And then, in front of everyone, he takes the bride by the hand or by the arm, sometimes literally lifting her and carrying her, and removes her from her mother's grasp. The mother resists symbolically. She cries out. There's a theatrical struggle. The bride might cry as well. Whether from genuine fear or from playing her role in the ceremony, it's often impossible to tell. This isn't random theater. It's deeply symbolic. It recreates, in formalized and manageable fashion, the mythological narrative of abduction that underlies Roman marriage theology. The most famous example is the rape of the Sabines, the foundational myth where early Roman men, having no women of their own, violently abducted women from neighboring tribes and forced them into marriage. That mythological narrative, horrifying as it is, became the template for how Romans understood marriage itself. The groom takes the bride, removes her from her family, claims her for himself. The abduction ritual makes that narrative safe and manageable. It allows a society to reenact a fundamentally violent origin story without actual violence. The bride is taken, but in a controlled, ceremonial, expected way. The mother resists, but knows this is coming. The violence is choreographed, ritualized, turned into theater. But the symbolism remains: the groom is taking what is his by right, removing the bride from her previous family, claiming her as property. The physical sensation of being seized, of being removed from your mother's arms, of being carried away by a man you may barely know. This creates a very real psychological experience, regardless of how much of the ritual is theater. The bride is experiencing physical removal, separation from her family, transition into the groom's family. Even if she knows it's coming, even if she understands it's ceremonial, her body and nervous system are experiencing something very like abduction. A mainstream historical fact that's well documented: the abduction ritual is described in multiple sources, from literary works to legal discussions of marriage ceremony. The ritual appears across different time periods and social classes, suggesting it was a widespread practice, not limited to the elite. The legal and literary sources are consistent enough about the details that we can be confident the ritual actually happened, that it was an expected part of the wedding ceremony. Here's a quirky detail that historians often overlook: there are references to grooms being particularly forceful or dramatic in their abductions, to it being seen as a display of strength or virility. A groom who seized his bride with impressive strength, who carried her with confidence, who performed the abduction with theatrical flair, was demonstrating masculine power. Conversely, a groom who fumbled the abduction, who was awkward or hesitant, was potentially inviting mockery. The abduction wasn't just ceremony, it was performance, and the groom's performance in this moment communicated something about his fitness as a husband and protector. Historians still argue about how much actual violence or genuine distress was involved in these abductions. Were they purely theatrical, with both the bride and her mother understanding their roles and playing them convincingly? Or did some brides experience genuine fear? Did some mothers genuinely resist, making the abduction more violent than ceremonial? The sources don't give us clarity on this. What we know is that the ritual happened, that it was expected, and that it symbolized a fundamentally violent transfer of the bride from one male authority to another. What's particularly unsettling about the abduction ritual is that it normalizes the idea of taking someone against their expressed will, even if that taking is ceremonial and expected. The bride learns through this ritual that her will doesn't matter. She can be physically seized, physically removed from her family, physically carried away by a man, and this is normal, this is expected, this is celebrated. The abduction ritual teaches her, in a very visceral way, that her body is not entirely her own, that it can be taken, that resistance is theater rather than real refusal. And when that ritual is followed immediately by escort to the bedroom, when it's followed by flute players drowning out sounds, by witnesses positioned outside, by the understanding that consummation must occur, the abduction takes on an additional dimension. The bride has just been physically removed from her family. She's been transported to a strange household. She's been handed to a man she barely knows, and now she's being taken to a bedroom where she's expected to submit to intercourse. The abduction ritual, in retrospect, looks less like theater and more like the first act of a much longer violation. Religious blessings: Jupiter was watching your bed. Because that's the reality you're living in, isn't it? This isn't just a private moment. It's a religiously consecrated moment, overseen by gods who are believed to be literally present, witnessing what happens in your bedroom. The religious framework transforms the bedroom into sacred space, and that sacredness both legitimizes what's happening and intensifies the pressure on both parties to perform correctly. The primary god overseeing the wedding is Hymen, the god of weddings and the wedding night. Hymen is invoked repeatedly throughout the wedding ceremony. Prayers are offered to Hymen. The flute players outside your door are invoking Hymen through their music. The torches that lit your procession were meant to honor Hymen. By the time you reach the bedroom, hymen is understood to be present, to be blessing the union, to be witnessing the consummation. But hymen isn't the only deity invested in your wedding night. Jupiter, the king of the gods, has interest in marriages, particularly in marriages that will produce legitimate children. Jupiter guarantees oaths and contracts. A marriage is, after all, a contract, and Jupiter oversees all contracts. His blessing is needed, his presence is invoked. Some wedding ceremonies explicitly call on Jupiter to bless the union and ensure fertility. There's also Juno, the goddess of marriage and women. Juno is invoked to bless the bride specifically, to protect her, to grant her fertility and safe childbearing. There's Priapus, a fertility god whose explicit sexual nature makes him relevant to the wedding night. There's Venus, goddess of love and sexuality, whose blessing is sought for the union. The bedroom, by the time you enter it, is understood to be crowded with divine presence. The religious framework creates several effects simultaneously. First, it legitimizes what's about to happen. The gods are blessing it, witnessing it, sanctioning it. This isn't just a private moment or a legal obligation. It's a religiously mandated act approved by the divine order itself. Second, it creates pressure. You're not just performing for your family members stationed outside the door. You're performing for the gods. The stakes are cosmic, not just social or legal. Third, it creates a sense that the bedroom is sacred space, that what happens there has religious significance beyond the merely physical or legal. A mainstream historical fact that's extensively documented, the religious aspects of Roman marriage were as important as the legal aspects. Marriage wasn't just a contract. It was a sacrament, in a sense, an act that required divine blessing and participation. The legal codes and the religious practices were intertwined. A marriage wasn't considered fully valid unless it had both legal and religious sanction. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Roman religious anxiety. There are references to people being concerned about bad omens on the wedding night. If the bride stumbled crossing the threshold, considered bad luck. If the torches went out, potentially an omen of fertility problems or marital strife. If animals behaved strangely, interpreted as divine commentary on the union. The wedding night wasn't just an intimate moment. It was a moment dense with portentous meaning, where everything that happened could be interpreted as divine communication. Historians still argue about how literally Romans believed in the presence of these gods. Were they believed to be actually present, watching, or were they understood more symbolically as representations of cosmic forces? The sources suggest that Romans took it seriously enough that they modified their behavior based on religious concerns. They consulted augurs about wedding timing. They made offerings to the gods. They interpreted omens. Whatever the exact nature of their belief, the gods were understood to be invested in the outcome of the wedding night. The religious framework has a particularly interesting effect on the bride. She's being married off by her family, a transaction she had no real say in. She's being transferred from one household to another, a loss of everything familiar. She's about to be physically intimate with a man she barely knows, an event that's likely to be painful and frightening. But the religious framework tells her that the gods are blessing this. The gods approve. The gods want this to happen. Jupiter, Juno, Hymen, Venus, all of the most powerful forces in the cosmos are sanctioning what's about to occur. Her fear or resistance isn't just social deviance. It's religious impiety. It's resistance to divine will. The gods make the violation sacred. They transform coercion into blessing. They make what might otherwise be recognized as harmful into something that's understood as cosmically mandated. And that's perhaps the most insidious aspect of the religious framework. It convinces everyone involved, the bride included, that what's happening isn't just permissible. It's necessary, it's divinely required. It's a sacred obligation. Fertility obsession, why Rome needed babies. And you're understanding now that your wedding night isn't just about you and your bride. It's about the state. It's about demographics. It's about Rome's survival. The entire elaborate machinery of the wedding night, the witnesses, the inspection, the religious blessing, the legal framework, all of it ultimately serves one purpose: ensuring that children are produced, that the population continues, that Rome remains strong. Rome was obsessed with fertility in a way that's difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The empire's power depended on a large population. Military strength meant more soldiers. Economic strength meant more workers, more taxpayers, more people to expand into new territories. Politically, families with many children had more power, more connections, more ability to extend influence through kinship networks. From a state perspective, encouraging reproduction wasn't just nice, it was essential. This obsession created explicit government policy. Augustus, one of Rome's most important emperors, actually passed laws designed to encourage marriage and childbearing. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus and the Lex Poppaea Poppaea created incentives for marriage and penalties for remaining unmarried. Men who married and had children gained certain legal privileges. Men and women who remained unmarried faced legal disabilities. They couldn't inherit property fully. They had limited legal standing. The government was literally trying to force people into marriage and reproduction through legal carrots and sticks. Your wedding night, in this context, isn't a private moment, it's a state obligation. The children you and your bride produce, if you produce them, aren't just your family's concern. They're Rome's concern. They're demographic resources. They're the future military and economic power of the empire. The witnesses outside your door aren't just there to verify consummation for legal purposes. They're there to ensure that Rome's reproductive interests are being served. The bride's role in this is particularly stark. She's been selected in part for her fertility potential. Young brides are preferred partly because they have more potential childbearing years ahead of them. Families with histories of fertility, women who had many children, women whose relatives had many children, are preferred. A woman who can't produce children is considered defective property. A man who can't produce children is considered a failed husband. The entire marriage is, at its core, about reproduction. A mainstream historical fact that's extensively documented, Augustus's fertility laws actually survived into the later empire and influenced Christian thinking about marriage and sexuality. The idea that marriage's primary purpose was reproduction became so embedded in Roman and later Christian thinking that it persists even in modern times. Modern people still often hear marriage described as being for reproduction, even though modern marriage clearly serves many other purposes. That framing traces directly back to Roman state policy. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Rome's reproductive anxiety. There are references to people being concerned that their spouses weren't fertile. Medical texts discuss tests for female fertility, ways to supposedly determine whether a woman could produce children. Some of these tests were absurd, applying substances to the cervix and seeing if the woman could smell them, supposedly indicating whether the reproductive tract was open and functional. Others involved checking whether the woman could conceive during the first month of marriage. If she didn't become pregnant immediately, anxiety set in that she might be infertile. Historians still argue about the actual fertility rates in Rome and how much of Rome's fertility anxiety was justified versus how much was paranoid. Some scholars argue that Roman fertility rates were actually relatively low by pre-modern standards, that the population wasn't growing as quickly as Rome needed it to. Others argue that fertility rates were adequate, that Rome's anxiety was more about political control than actual demographic necessity. But regardless of the actual fertility rate, the anxiety was real and it shaped behavior. What matters is that you're entering your wedding night understanding that your bride's primary value, in Rome's eyes, is her capacity to produce children, not her character, not her intelligence, not her happiness, her fertility. The entire wedding ceremony has been designed, in part, to facilitate reproduction. The witnesses, the inspection, the religious blessing, all of it is aimed at ensuring that children will result. And for your bride specifically, the pressure is immense. She understands, whether explicitly or implicitly, that her worth in her new household will be measured by her ability to become pregnant, to carry pregnancies to term, to produce healthy children, preferably sons. Every month that passes without pregnancy is a failure. Every miscarriage is a personal tragedy and a family humiliation. Her body, from this moment forward, is understood to exist primarily for reproduction. Her sexuality exists for reproduction. Her value exists for reproduction. The wedding night is the first test. Can she become pregnant? Will she conceive immediately? Some brides understood that their entire future in their new household, their security, their status, their safety, depended on becoming pregnant quickly. The pressure to conceive wasn't just personal, it was existential, and it shaped the wedding night from the moment you closed the door. The woman's perspective silent and surveilled, and you need to shift your focus now, to step into the experience of the bride, to understand what it feels like to be on the other side of all of this machinery. Because while you've been understanding the systems and rituals, the bride has been living through them with a completely different awareness, a different vulnerability, a different kind of terror. She's known about this marriage for years, possibly since childhood. Her father arranged it. She was betrothed to a man she'd never met. She had no say in the decision. She watched her family make financial arrangements around her future, watched her father negotiate terms with another man's father, watched her value being calculated in terms of dowry and property. She understood, from childhood, that she was being sold. As the wedding day approached, she was prepared by the women in her family. Her mother, her aunts, her older female relatives gave her instructions, some practical, some superstitious, all designed to help her survive what was coming. Some of them might have told her what to expect. Others might have maintained a profound silence, leaving her to figure it out through whispers with other women or through her own fearful imagination. Either way, she was being prepared for something that the women in her life clearly understood was difficult. On the wedding day itself, she was dressed in her special tunic and veil. She was displayed at the feast. She watched people celebrate her transition from her family to her husband's family. She experienced the abduction, being seized by this man she barely knew, being physically removed from her mother's arms, being carried away. Even if she knew it was coming, even if it was ceremonial, her body experienced it as violation. She was taken, she was removed, she was claimed. Then came the escort to the bedroom. The flute players starting their loud, relentless music, the attendants surrounding her, the knowledge that people were watching, waiting, listening. She was being processed through a series of rituals designed to culminate in her sexual penetration by a stranger. And at every step, she had no agency. She couldn't refuse. She couldn't slow things down. She couldn't ask for privacy or gentleness or time to adjust. She could only comply. When she finally entered the bedroom, she was likely terrified. She might have been physically trembling. She might have been experiencing extreme anxiety or even panic, and there was nothing she could do about any of it. She couldn't tell anyone how she was feeling. She couldn't ask for help. She couldn't refuse what was about to happen. She had to submit, a mainstream historical fact that's been established through careful historical analysis. Roman women of respectable families had virtually no sexual education before marriage. They might have vague ideas about what would happen, but detailed knowledge was rare. Many brides were essentially going into a sexual experience completely unprepared, with no understanding of what their bodies would experience, no knowledge of what was expected of them, no framework for understanding what was happening to them. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the bride's experience. There are references in some sources to brides being given advice on how to position themselves during intercourse. Advice that suggests some brides didn't know how to physically accommodate intercourse. They had to be instructed. They had to be guided through positions. They had to be taught, essentially, how to be sexually penetrated. The fact that such instruction was apparently necessary suggests that many brides had no prior knowledge of sexual mechanics, no preparation for what their bodies would experience. Historians still argue about what the bride's emotional experience was like, and the truth is that we have very limited sources from the bride's perspective. We have descriptions of weddings from male writers. We have legal codes written by men. We have medical texts written by men. We have almost nothing from brides themselves describing their experience. The bride's internal experience is largely absent from the historical record, which is itself a form of erasure. What we can infer is that the bride was experiencing profound vulnerability. She had been separated from her family. She was in a strange household, surrounded by strangers, her new family. She was about to have sex with a man she barely knew. She was aware that her body would be inspected the next morning. She was aware that the inspection results would determine, in some sense, her value and her security in this new household. She was under pressure to bleed, to show signs of virginity loss, to provide physical evidence that she was what she claimed to be. And she was silent throughout. She had no voice in the decision making that led to this night. She had no voice in the wedding ceremony. She had no voice in whether consummation would occur. She had no voice in the inspection that would follow. She was an object being processed through a series of rituals, a piece of property being transferred from one household to another, a body being appropriated for reproduction. Her silence wasn't chosen. It was imposed. It was the condition of her existence as a married woman in Roman society. Marital, rights, and the law's troubling definitions. Because that's what consummation ultimately is, isn't it? It's the legal exercise of a right. The groom has a right, granted by Roman law, to sexual access to his wife. The wife has an obligation, imposed by Roman law, to submit to that access. The wedding night is the moment when that right is first exercised, when that obligation is first enforced. Roman law was remarkably explicit about what marriage granted to the groom. He had the right to his wife's sexual services. He had the right to her labor. He had the right to her property, depending on the type of marriage. He had the right to determine where she lived, who she saw, what she did. These rights weren't granted conditionally or temporarily. They were permanent, absolute, and essentially unrevocable without his consent or under very specific legal circumstances. The wife's obligations were equally explicit in the law's logic. She was obligated to remain in her husband's home. She was obligated to manage his household. She was obligated to produce children. And she was obligated to submit to his sexual demands. This last obligation isn't always stated explicitly, but it's implied throughout Roman legal discussions of marriage. A husband couldn't be accused of sexual assault against his wife because, by definition, a wife couldn't be assaulted by her husband. She was his. He had the right. She had the obligation. This legal framework had genuine consequences. If a wife refused sexual access to her husband, she was violating her marital obligation. He had legal grounds to punish her. He could confine her to the house. He could deny her access to money or property. He could beat her. In some cases, he could even divorce her for this refusal, and the divorce would be considered her fault, which could result in loss of her dowry and public humiliation. The law structured marriage as a relationship where the husband's sexual demands were legally enforceable and the wife's refusal was legally punishable. The flip side of this is that a wife had virtually no recourse if her husband was violent during sex, if he harmed her, if he caused her physical injury. She couldn't sue him. She couldn't seek legal protection. The law didn't recognize injury inflicted during sex as assault because, by definition, a husband couldn't assault his wife. He was exercising his legal right, a mainstream historical fact that legal historians have thoroughly established. Roman law did not recognize the concept of marital rape. A husband couldn't commit rape against his wife because rape, by definition in Roman law, involved violating someone's sexual autonomy. A wife had no sexual autonomy. She had surrendered it upon marriage. She had no right to refuse. Therefore, no violation was possible. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the legal logic. There are references in legal sources to husbands being able to sue other men for seducing their wives, and the damages they could claim were based on the theft of the wife's sexual services. The wife herself wasn't the victim in this scenario. In the law's view, the husband was the victim. He'd been deprived of exclusive access to his wife's sexuality. The wife was property that had been damaged or had had its services compromised. The legal framework understood sexual access as a property right, not as a personal boundary. Historians still debate how these legal frameworks actually played out in practice. Did Roman marriages really function exactly as the law describes? Or did many couples develop more egalitarian relationships, more genuine partnerships? Despite what the law supposedly mandated, the evidence suggests considerable variation. Some marriages were probably as oppressive as the law suggests. Others probably developed more mutual respect and affection. But the legal framework remained, and it gave husbands enormous power and wives essentially no protection. What matters for understanding your wedding night is that you're exercising a legal right. You're not asking permission. You're not seeking consent in any modern sense. You're claiming what the law says is yours. The bride isn't consenting. She's complying with a legal obligation. She's submitting to your right because she has no legal choice. And here's the troubling part: this legal framework, while it seems alien and oppressive to modern sensibilities, wasn't understood by Romans as oppressive. It was understood as the natural order. It was understood as proper. A wife was supposed to submit. A husband was supposed to demand. That was marriage. That was the deal that had been made when the bride was betrothed years earlier. She was being transferred to you specifically so that you could have exclusive sexual access to her. The wedding night was you claiming what had been promised to you. The law made it clear she was yours, not in the sense of being a person with whom you shared a life, but in the literal sense of being property, your legal property, with all the rights of ownership that entailed. Class differences, patrician vests, plebeian wedding nights, and you're discovering now that the elaborate rituals you've been exploring weren't equally accessible or experienced across all of Roman society. A wealthy patrician family's wedding night ceremony was a completely different beast from a working class family's experience. The machinery of wedding night control was most elaborate, most thoroughly documented, most completely realized among the elite. For ordinary people, reality was messier, more improvised, less ceremonially choreographed. For a patrician bride, a woman from one of Rome's aristocratic families, the wedding night was indeed the elaborate theatrical production you've been imagining. Multiple attendants, musicians, formal escort through the streets. The bride dressed in expensive fabrics dyed with costly saffron. The groom's family and the bride's family both present to witness and verify. Legal documents potentially drawn up beforehand, specifying the terms of the marriage. Medical professionals potentially on standby. The inspection the next morning conducted by matrons of status and authority. Every element of the ritual fully realized, fully observed, fully documented. For a plebeian or lower class couple, the wedding night might look very different. They might marry in a simple ceremony at home rather than a public procession. They might have fewer attendants, perhaps just close family members rather than a full wedding party. The bride might wear her best clothes, but not necessarily a saffron-dyed tunic. The dye was expensive. The escort to the bedroom might be brief and simple, rather than a lengthy procession through the streets. The inspection the next morning might be perfunctory, conducted by the bride's mother and perhaps one or two other female relatives, rather than by a formal group of matrons. But beyond the specific ceremonies, class differences shape the fundamental experience of the wedding night. For an aristocratic bride, the wedding night was part of a larger political and economic transaction. The marriage had been carefully negotiated. The dowry had been precisely calculated. The families had political reasons for the alliance. The wedding night was the consummation, literally and figuratively, of a major family business deal. For a lower-class couple, the wedding night might be more about household formation, about two families uniting their labor and resources, about creating a reproductive unit. An important class difference involved literacy and legal documentation. Aristocratic families often had written marriage contracts specifying terms, dowry amounts, and obligations. Plebeian marriages often happened without written documentation, relying instead on oral agreement and community witness. This meant that for lower-class couples, there was less legal machinery around the marriage, less documentation of what was agreed to, less formal recourse if one party violated the agreement. A mainstream historical fact that historians have established: lower-class Romans, including enslaved people and freed people, had fewer legal protections in marriage generally. They might not have access to the same legal remedies as patricians. Their marriages might not have the same legal standing. A lower-class bride had fewer protections, fewer legal options if her marriage went wrong, fewer ways to enforce her rights. Here's a quirky detail that reveals class differences. Wealthy patrician families sometimes had their marriages arranged through intermediaries, professional matchmakers, or family friends who negotiated terms. Poorer families likely married more directly, with families or individuals meeting and negotiating themselves. The economic sophistication was different. The time available for negotiation was different. The stakes were different. Historians still argue about how much lower class Romans actually participated in these elaborate wedding ceremonies. Did working class families have the time and resources to conduct formal processions, hire musicians, invite large groups of witnesses? Or did many lower class weddings happen much more simply, with minimal ceremony? The sources are sparse on this point. The detailed descriptions of wedding ceremonies come from elite sources, often literary rather than documentary. We simply don't have detailed accounts of ordinary people's weddings. What seems likely is that class created a spectrum rather than a binary. The wealthiest patrician families conducted the most elaborate ceremonies. The poorest people conducted simpler affairs. Most people probably fell somewhere in the middle, conducting reasonably elaborate ceremonies, but without the full extravagance of the highest elite. But the fundamental dynamics remained consistent across classes. The bride was being transferred from one household to another. The husband had legal rights to her sexuality. The marriage was economically motivated, whatever emotional affection might develop later. The wedding night was about consummation, about legal verification, about beginning the reproductive project. The difference was in the resources available to enforce these dynamics. An aristocratic bride who refused her husband's sexual demands could be punished, could be confined, could be divorced. Her husband had family resources to back up his authority. A lower-class bride in the same situation might face the same legal consequences, but her ability to seek support from her family, her ability to protect herself was more limited. She had fewer legal options. She had fewer family resources. She was, in some ways, more vulnerable to her husband's authority because she had fewer escape routes, fewer protections, fewer alternatives. The divorced woman's humiliation? What came after? Because the wedding night isn't just about beginning a marriage. It's also about establishing terms that will govern what happens if the marriage fails. And for a woman, divorce is potentially catastrophic in ways that it isn't for a man. If your bride fails the inspection, if there's no blood, if there are no visible signs of virginity loss, you have grounds to divorce her immediately. The marriage is barely hours old, and it's already over. You can declare the marriage invalid due to fraud. You can demand return of the dowry. You can publicly accuse her of pre-marital infidelity. The consequences for her are severe and immediate. But even if the inspection passes, if the marriage is deemed valid and consummation is confirmed, divorce remains possible for any number of reasons. Roman law, particularly in the later imperial period, actually made divorce relatively easy. Either party could theoretically initiate divorce, but the consequences were wildly different depending on whether you were the divorcing man or the divorcing woman. If you divorce your wife for infidelity, or even for suspected infidelity, or for failing to produce children after a reasonable time, or for numerous other grounds, she faces public humiliation. She returns to her father's household as a divorced woman, which is a social status that carries stigma. She might lose her dowry, which means her family has lost money. She loses her status as a married woman, which was one of the few statuses that granted Roman women any kind of security and respectability. She's now a divorcee, and that label carries implications about her sexuality, her loyalty, her value. If she divorces you, if she initiates the divorce, the social consequences are potentially even worse. She's accused of being dissatisfied with her husband, which implies something is wrong with her, not with him. She might lose her dowry anyway, depending on the grounds for divorce and the specific legal circumstances. She faces accusations of being difficult, demanding, unreasonable. She's labeled as a woman who couldn't make a marriage work, which in Roman society is essentially a woman's primary responsibility. And here's the truly dark part. If your bride is divorced shortly after the wedding night, if the marriage is dissolved because she failed the inspection or for some other reason attributed to her inadequacy, she faces a particularly harsh situation. She's no longer a virgin. That status is gone forever, consumed in the failed marriage. She's not yet old enough, typically, to remarry easily. She has limited economic prospects. She has limited respectability. She's damaged goods in the marriage market. and everyone knows it. A mainstream historical fact that's thoroughly documented: divorce in Rome, while legally available, was socially costly for women in ways it wasn't for men. A man could divorce a wife and quickly remarry. A divorced woman faced a much harder time remarrying, faced questions about why her previous marriage failed, faced suspicion that she was somehow defective or difficult. The double standard was profound. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the system's cruelty. There are references to women being divorced immediately after being found non-virgin at inspection, sometimes within days of the wedding. The marriage was so quickly dissolved that the bride hadn't even had time to understand herself as a wife. She was married and unmarried within a matter of hours or days. She was transferred to her husband's household and then expelled from it almost immediately. The humiliation was compounded by the speed and the public awareness that the marriage had failed essentially before it began. Historians still argue about how common immediate post-inspection divorces actually were. Some scholars argue that they were relatively rare, that families would typically try to work through inspection failures using alternative explanations or political pressure. Others argue that they happened frequently enough to be a genuine concern, that the threat of immediate divorce was a real pressure on brides. What's not argued is that immediate divorce was legally possible and that it was catastrophic for the bride. What matters is that your bride is entering her wedding night aware that if things go wrong, if she doesn't bleed, if there's some other problem with the consummation, if you decide you're not satisfied for any reason, she could be divorced almost immediately. She could be expelled from her new household. She could return to her father's house as a divorcee, her virginity gone, her reputation damaged, her prospects dramatically diminished. The threat of divorce is hanging over her from the moment she enters the bedroom. And if she becomes pregnant from this one night, if consummation results in conception, her situation changes slightly but remains precarious. She's now bound to you as the mother of your child, which gives her slightly more security. But if you divorce her while pregnant, if you divorce her while she's raising your infant, she's still a divorced woman trying to manage alone or return to her family. She still faces all the social stigma and economic difficulty. The fact that she's carrying or raising your child doesn't protect her from the legal right of divorce. The wedding night is, in this sense, the beginning of a marriage that could end at any moment, with catastrophic consequences for the bride, but relatively minor consequences for you. Slavery and the darkest wedding customs. And you're stepping now into territory that's even more disturbing than what you've already explored, because for enslaved people, the wedding night rituals you've been examining don't apply, which paradoxically means the situation is worse. Enslaved people in Rome had no legal right to marry. They could form partnerships, they could have children, but these relationships had no legal standing. They could be separated at any moment by their owner's decision. If an enslaved man and enslaved woman were allowed by their owner to form a partnership, sometimes called a marriage, though it had no legal validity, there was no wedding ceremony, no dowry, no legal contract, no inspection, no witnesses verifying consummation. There was just the owner's decision that these two people would live together and presumably produce children. If the owner wanted to ensure consummation happened, he could simply order it. There was no need for the elaborate ritual machinery because there was no legal framework to satisfy. The enslaved couple had no legal existence. They were property. What happened on the wedding night, if you can even call it that, for an enslaved couple was whatever the owner wanted to happen. If the owner wanted to watch, he could watch. If he wanted to participate, he could participate. If he wanted to supervise to ensure the couple produced children, he could do that. An enslaved woman had no legal protection against rape because an enslaved person couldn't be raped. They were property. Property can't be violated. It can only be used. There's a particularly dark practice documented in some sources. Owners deliberately forcing enslaved people into sexual relationships, specifically to produce children who would be born into slavery. An owner might decide that his female enslaved worker should be impregnated by a particular male enslaved worker, perhaps the strongest one or the healthiest one, or simply whoever was available. The owner would order them to have sex. The enslaved woman would be forced. The enslaved man would be coerced. The children born from this forced union would belong to the owner. For an enslaved woman specifically, the lack of legal marriage protection meant she had no control over her sexuality. An owner could force her into sexual relationships with other enslaved people. An owner could force her into sexual relationships with himself. An owner could sell her and separate her from any partner or children she had. She could be sexually assaulted without legal recourse, because assault requires violating someone's legal rights, and she had no legal rights. The only slightly protective factor was that some owners apparently believed that enslaved women who were allowed to form stable partnerships would be more productive, would work harder, would be less likely to attempt escape. So some owners deliberately allowed enslaved couples to stay together, to form what looked like families, because the stability was economically beneficial. But this was entirely at the owner's discretion. It could be revoked at any moment. A mainstream historical fact that's been established through careful historical analysis: enslaved people in Rome had no legal marriage rights. They could form partnerships, but these partnerships could be dissolved at the owner's whim. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's status. An enslaved person could be separated from their partner and children at any moment if the owner decided to sell them or transfer them. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the system's dehumanization. There are references in some sources to owners deliberately pairing enslaved people in ways designed to produce children with specific characteristics. An owner might want to breed two strong enslaved workers together to produce strong children. This is the language and logic of animal husbandry applied to human beings. The enslaved people involved had no say in the pairing. They had no say in whether to reproduce. Their reproductive capacity was being managed by their owner for economic benefit. Historians still debate how widespread forced reproduction of enslaved people actually was. Some scholars argue that it was a common practice, particularly in rural agricultural contexts where owners wanted to increase their enslaved workforce. Others argue that it was less common, that owners preferred to purchase enslaved people rather than breed them. But the evidence suggests it definitely happened, that it was legal, and that it created generations of people born into bondage specifically as a result of forced reproduction. What's particularly important to understand is that enslaved women's wedding nights, if they had them at all, were completely outside the framework of legal protection that even the most oppressed free women had. A free woman of the lowest social class at least had the protection of marriage law, limited as it was. An enslaved woman had no such protection. She could be forced to have sex by her owner. She could be forced to have sex by other enslaved people under her owner's direction. She had no recourse. She had no protection. She had no voice. The wedding night rituals you've been exploring, the inspection, the witnesses, the legal framework, were, in a twisted way, forms of protection for free women. They established legal boundaries, created witnesses, created records, created the possibility of legal recourse if something went wrong. An enslaved woman had none of this. She had no boundaries. She had no witnesses to protect her. She had no legal recourse. She was completely exposed to sexual violence because her owner had absolute authority over her body. This is the darkest part of the Roman wedding night story for most enslaved women. There was no wedding night ritual at all. There was just the owner's will and their complete lack of ability to refuse. Why Christianity later found all this deeply offensive, and your understanding now that the elaborate machinery of the Roman wedding night, the legal frameworks, the inspection rituals, the assumption of male authority over female sexuality, all of this would eventually become incompatible with Christian theology. When Christianity began to spread through Rome and eventually to become the state religion, one of the fundamental areas where Christian teaching conflicted with Roman practice was marriage and sexuality. Early Christian thinkers were horrified by what they saw in Roman marriage practices. They were appalled by the inspection of brides. They were appalled by the casual way Roman men could divorce their wives. They were appalled by the legal framework that gave men absolute sexual authority over their wives. They were appalled by the treatment of sexuality as primarily instrumental. existing for reproduction and property transfer rather than for spiritual union or mutual love. The earliest Christian writings on marriage emphasize mutual obligation and love in ways that Roman law simply didn't. Paul writes about husbands and wives having mutual duties to each other, about sexual relations being something that both parties owe to each other, about marriage being a sacred bond rather than a property transfer. This is radically different from Roman legal thinking. In Roman law, the husband had the right and the wife had the obligation. In Christian thinking, there were mutual rights and mutual obligations. Christian thinkers also began to develop the idea that sex could have purposes beyond reproduction. Sex within marriage could be about expressing love, about spiritual union, about the joining of two souls. This was radical in a Roman context where sex was primarily understood as instrumental. It was for producing children, it was for satisfying male sexual desire, it was for demonstrating authority. The idea that sex could be about mutual love and spiritual connection was foreign to Roman thinking. The inspection of brides was particularly offensive to Christian sensibility. The idea that a woman's value could be determined by whether she bled on her wedding night, the idea that her virginity had to be physically verified, the idea that her body would be examined by matrons the morning after, all of this seemed to Christians to reduce women to their reproductive capacity, to treat them as property to be inspected rather than as souls to be saved. A mainstream historical fact that's been thoroughly documented, early Christian teaching on marriage, while it retained much of the patriarchal structure of Roman society, did introduce some protections for women that Roman law didn't provide. Christian theology developed concepts of marital consent, of the spiritual equality of souls regardless of social status, of women as moral agents rather than merely as property. These ideas were revolutionary in the context of Roman society. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the shift in thinking. Early Christian writers began to argue against the inspection of brides. They argued that a woman's virginity was a matter between her family, and God. It wasn't something that should be physically verified by matrons. The very act of inspection was considered spiritually degrading. This is a remarkable shift from Roman thinking, where the inspection was simply normal procedure. Historians still argue about how thoroughly Christianity actually changed marriage practices when it became the state religion. Some scholars argue that many Roman practices persisted despite Christian objections, that the change was slower and more incomplete than Christian writers hope. Others argue that Christianity did fundamentally reshape how marriage was understood and practiced, particularly regarding consent and the spiritual nature of the union. What's clear is that Christian thinking created a fundamental incompatibility with the Roman wedding night as it had been practiced. The inspection couldn't continue in the same form. The idea that a wife was simply property, that a husband had absolute authority, over became theologically problematic. The idea that sexuality was purely instrumental became incompatible with Christian theology of the body and spiritual union. By the medieval period, the wedding night had transformed. There was still consummation. The marriage still needed to be completed through sexual intercourse. But the public inspection, the matrons examining the bride, the witnesses gathering evidence, these practices gradually disappeared. They were replaced with more private, more spiritualized understandings of the marriage union. The irony is that while Christian theology reformed many of the most abusive aspects of the Roman wedding night, it also created new frameworks for controlling sexuality and marriage that would prove oppressive in different ways. The emphasis on procreation as the primary purpose of sex, the regulation of sexuality outside of marriage, the control of women's sexuality through religious authority rather than legal authority. These Christian innovations created different but equally constraining systems. But compared to the Roman wedding night, the inspection, the witnesses, the legal machinery designed to verify consummation and determine value, the Christian reforms seemed revolutionary. They protected some privacy. They emphasized spiritual union over property transfer. They gave women slightly more voice, slightly more agency, slightly more recognition as moral beings rather than merely as reproductive property. The Roman wedding night rituals you've been exploring would eventually become unthinkable. not because society suddenly became more enlightened, but because a new religious framework came to power that found those practices spiritually abhorrent. The machinery of surveillance and control simply shifted forms. It didn't disappear. Historians still argue about what really happened, and you're discovering now that much of what you've been exploring exists in a fog of historical uncertainty. We have legal codes that describe how things were supposed to work. We have literary descriptions that might be exaggerated or might be accurate representations. We have scattered references in medical texts, in letters, in legal documents. But we don't have comprehensive, reliable accounts of how the wedding night actually functioned across Rome's vast, diverse territories over multiple centuries. The scholarly debates are real and significant. Did all the rituals you've been exploring actually happen in every wedding, or were they ideals that existed more in law and literature than in actual practice? Were they performed more rigorously among the elite and more casually among ordinary people? Did they vary significantly by region, with some provinces practicing them intensively while others barely observed them? The evidence simply doesn't allow for definitive answers. Take the inspection of the bride, for instance. The legal sources reference it. The literary sources describe it. But how universal was it actually? Did every family conduct the inspection? Did some families skip it? Did some regions practice it while others didn't? We simply don't know. Some scholars argue that the inspection was a standard practice that happened in most marriages. Others argue that it was an ideal described in legal theory, but practiced less consistently in reality. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. Or consider the witnesses stationed outside the bedroom door. The literary sources describe people listening intently for sounds of consummation. But were they actually doing that in most marriages? Or were they primarily stationed there as a formality, a legal requirement, without actually focusing intently on what was happening? We can't be certain. The most detailed accounts come from comedic or dramatic sources, which might be exaggerating for effect. A mainstream historical fact that's been thoroughly established, our knowledge of Roman wedding night practices comes primarily from legal texts, literary sources, and scattered references in medical and other writings. We have no comprehensive ethnographic accounts. We have no systematic surveys. We have no diaries from brides or grooms describing their experience. We're reconstructing practices from fragmentary sources that weren't necessarily meant to be comprehensive or accurate descriptions. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the limitations of our evidence. Some of the most detailed descriptions of wedding night rituals come from Roman comedy, particularly from the plays of Plautus and Terence. These are comedic depictions meant to be funny. They likely exaggerate for comic effect. But they're also, in many cases, our most vivid sources. We're relying on comedic exaggeration to understand what might have actually happened. Historians still vigorously debate the significance of social class differences. Did lower class Romans actually conduct simplified versions of the wedding night rituals? Or did they conduct different rituals entirely? We simply don't have detailed sources about working class or poor people's weddings. The detailed descriptions come from elite sources. We're projecting outward from the elite experience and assuming that lower class people either did the same thing or simpler versions of it. But we're not certain. There's also significant scholarly debate about chronological change. Did the wedding night rituals remain consistent across the Republic and Empire, or did they change significantly over time? Did practices in the early Republic look the same as practices in the later Empire? The sources suggest some changes, particularly the gradual movement away from some of the more extreme practices, but the exact nature and timing of these changes is unclear. And then there's the question of regional variation. Rome was a vast empire with diverse populations, different cultural traditions, different legal systems in conquered territories. Did the wedding night practices described in Roman legal sources apply uniformly across all territories? Or did conquered peoples maintain their own marriage practices alongside Roman law? We have some evidence of local variation, but we don't have comprehensive information about how widespread it was. Perhaps most importantly, historians still debate what the bride's actual experience was like. We can describe the rituals. We can describe the legal framework. but understanding how the bride experienced these rituals, what she felt, how she understood what was happening to her. This is almost entirely inaccessible to us. We're reading the experience through male sources, through legal codes, through literature written by men. The bride's own understanding of her experience is largely lost to history. Some scholars argue that brides were traumatized by these rituals, that the inspection and the witnesses and the public nature of consummation created lasting psychological harm. Others argue that we shouldn't project modern sensibilities onto historical people, that brides who grew up understanding these rituals as normal probably experienced them differently than a modern person would. The truth is we simply don't know. What we can say with certainty is this: the Roman legal and literary sources describe a wedding night that was heavily ritualized, heavily surveilled, heavily managed by families and legal authorities. Whether this description reflects universal practice or idealized theory, whether it applies equally to all social classes, whether it remained consistent over time, these are questions where reasonable scholars disagree. But the machinery of control, the legal frameworks of authority, the assumption that the bride's body belonged to her husband, these things are unambiguous in the sources, even if we're uncertain about how consistently they were practiced. Modern echoes. We didn't escape this legacy, and you're understanding now that the Roman wedding night didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. It transformed, it evolved, it adapted to new religious and social frameworks. But many of its fundamental assumptions about marriage, about gender, about the wedding night itself, persist in ways that most modern people don't even recognize. The white wedding dress, for instance. You've learned that the bride's distinctive wedding attire traces back to the Roman tunica recta and flammeum. But the modern white wedding dress, the iconic image of a bride in flowing white fabric, is actually a Victorian invention, popularized by Queen Victoria in the 19th century. Yet the concept of distinctive bridal attire, of the bride being visually marked as a bride through her clothing, is directly descended from Roman practice. The bride is still being displayed, still being visually distinguished as someone transitioning into marriage, still being marked as property being transferred. The wedding veil, that direct descendant of the Roman flammeum, persists in modern weddings. Brides still wear veils. They still have veils lifted by the groom at the altar or after the ceremony. The specific gesture of unveiling the bride is a direct echo of the Roman groom untying the nodus herculaneus and removing the bride's veil. The symbolic meaning has shifted slightly. It's now often about the groom seeing his bride for the first time, about intimacy beginning. But the core gesture persists. The bride is still being unveiled, still being revealed to her new husband, still being marked as his. The concept of consummation, the idea that a marriage must be completed through sexual intercourse, persists in modern law and culture. While the legal emphasis on consummation has diminished, it hasn't disappeared entirely. Some jurisdictions still recognize consummation as legally significant, and in popular culture, the wedding night remains a significant moment. The idea that sexual intercourse should happen on the wedding night persists. The assumption that the couple will be sexually intimate immediately after the wedding ceremony remains common. The inspection of the bride, in its literal form, matrons examining the bride's genitals, has disappeared. But the cultural obsession with female virginity, with determining whether a bride was a virgin before marriage, persists. The hymen has become a cultural obsession in ways that would seem absurd if they weren't so serious. Young women are still told that their virginity is valuable, that their hymen is evidence of their purity, that losing virginity before marriage is shameful. The inspection is gone, but the underlying assumption that a woman's value is tied to her sexual history persists. A mainstream historical fact that's been thoroughly documented. The concept of female virginity as a marker of honor and value persists across cultures and time periods. Anthropologists and historians have traced how this concept, rooted in property transfer and paternity certainty, has evolved and persisted even in modern societies that have moved away from many other aspects of patriarchal marriage. The obsession with female virginity is, in many ways, a direct legacy of the Roman wedding night inspection. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the persistence of Roman assumptions. modern wedding traditions still include the groom carrying the bride across the threshold. You've learned that this traces back to the Roman wedding night, to the formal carrying of the bride into the bedroom. The specific gesture persists. The symbolic meaning, that the groom is claiming the bride, that he's taking her into his space, that he's assuming authority over her, persists, even if most modern people don't consciously understand it that way. Historians still debate the extent to which modern wedding traditions are direct descendants of Roman practices versus the extent to which similar practices emerged independently in different cultures. Some traditions probably do trace directly back to Rome. Others probably emerged from similar social logic: the need to mark transitions, the need to establish witnesses, the need to make the private public, without being direct descendants of Roman practice. What's clear is that many fundamental assumptions about the wedding night persist. The idea that the wedding night should be special, should be private but verified, should involve consummation, should mark a transition in the bride's status. These ideas persist. The assumption that the groom has authority in the bedroom, that the bride should submit, that the husband's desires take precedence. These assumptions persist, though they're increasingly challenged by modern feminist critique. Modern people joke about wedding night embarrassment, about wedding night performance anxiety, about the first night together. These jokes persist because the ideas they're joking about, that the wedding night is public knowledge, that there's pressure to perform, that the wedding night is somehow different from ordinary sex, persist. The surveillance is gone, the inspection is gone, the witnesses are mostly gone. But the cultural weight of the wedding night persists. And in some cultures and communities, the inspection persists too. In some parts of the world, the practice of examining the bride the morning after the wedding, of verifying virginity through bloodstains on the bedding, continues. In some communities, the groom's family still gathers outside the bedroom door, waiting for confirmation of consummation. The specific practices vary, the legal framework has changed, but the fundamental dynamic, the public verification of private intimacy, the inspection of the bride's body, the assumption that the bride's virginity is communal property to be verified, persists. The Roman wedding night didn't end with Rome. It evolved, it adapted, it lost some of its most egregious elements, but it never entirely disappeared. It lives on in our wedding traditions, in our assumptions about marriage, in the way we still mark the wedding night as different from ordinary sex, in the way we still, often unconsciously, treat the bride's body as something to be displayed, verified, and claimed by the groom.
The wedding night as
Rome's mirror,
you're stepping back
and you're
now,
stepping back
looking
now,
at everything
looking
you've
at everything you've
and
explored,
understanding that
and
the
understanding that the Roman
wasn't
wedding
an
night
aberration.
wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a bizarre exception to how Rome otherwise functioned.
It was, in many ways,
It was,
Rome's entire
in many
system
ways,
in miniature.
Rome's entire system in miniature, the concentration of male
human
authority,
beings into property,
the conversion of human beings into
private
property,
life, the assumption
the public
that the state
management
had an
of private
interest in
life,
controlling
the
intimate
assumption
moments.
that the state had an interest in controlling intimate moments, the legal frameworks that made certain kinds of violations impossible, because the violated
The wedding
person
night
had no
reveals
legal
Rome's
rights to
fundamental
violate.
architecture.
The wedding
It
night
shows you how
reveals
Rome
Rome's
thought
fundamental
about women
architecture.
as property,
It shows
as
you how
reproductive
Rome thought about
capacity,
women as
beings
property,
without legal
as reproductive
autonomy.
capacity, as beings without legal autonomy. It shows you how Rome thought about power as something that
And
should
ritual.
be absolute,
That should be public
that should
and
be
visible,
enforced through
rather
law
than hidden.
and ritual,
It
that should
shows
be
you how
public and
Rome
visible
thought about
rather than
sexuality
hidden.
as
It shows you
instrumental,
how Rome
as
thought
something
about
existing for
sexuality as
reproduction
instrumental,
and demonstration
as something
of authority,
existing for
rather
reproduction
than for
and
mutual
demonstration
pleasure
of
or
authority,
spiritual
rather
connection.
than for mutual
It shows
pleasure
you how
or
Rome
spiritual
thought about the
connection.
family
It
as
shows
a
you how
unit
Rome thought
controlled
about
by
the
one
family
man,
as a unit
with
controlled
everyone
by
else
one man,
wife,
with
children,
everyone else,
enslaved people
wife,
existing
children,
as his
enslaved
dependents.
people, existing as his dependents. When you zoom out from the bedroom, when you look at Roman society as a whole, the wedding night rituals make perfect sense. They're not aberrant. They're consistent with how Rome organized almost everything else. The paterfamilias had absolute authority over his household. The bride, entering that household, had lost her autonomy. The inspection, the witnesses, the legal framework, these were just formalizing what the law already said: she was property. The rituals made the abstract legal reality concrete and visible. The wedding night also reveals Rome's peculiar combination of sophistication and brutality. Rome was advanced enough to develop sophisticated legal codes, to create written law that governed vast territories, to establish complex administrative systems.
Same civilization
and yet
created
that
a
same
system
civilization
where a
created a
husband could
system
legally rape his
where a
wife
husband could
because she
legally
had
rape
no
his
legal
wife
rights to
because she had
violate.
no legal rights
That
to
same
violate.
civilization
That same
created a
civilization
system
created
where
a
women were
system
property
where women were
transfers
property
between men.
transfers between
That
men.
same civilization
That same
created a
civilization
system
created
where
a
the state
system
intervened
where
in
the
the most
state
intimate
intervened
moments
in
of
the most
people's
intimate
lives in
moments of
service of
people's
demographic
lives
goals.
in service of
Rome also
demographic
reveals
goals.
something about how oppression
Rome also
works.
reveals
It's
something
not
about
always
how
violent
oppression
and
works.
obvious.
It's not always
The wedding
violent and
night
obvious.
wasn't primarily about
The wedding
physical
night
violence,
wasn't primarily
though
about
violence
physical
was certainly
violence,
possible.
though violence
It was about
certainly
ritual,
possible.
about law,
It was about
the
ritual,
normalization
about law,
of authority.
about the normalization
It was
of
about
authority.
making the bride understand
It was about making
through
the bride
ceremony
understand
and inspection
through ceremony
and
and
witnesses
inspection
that
and
her body
witnesses
was not
that her
hers,
body was
that her
not hers,
sexuality
that her
was not
sexuality
hers,
was
that
not
she
hers,
existed now
that she
to serve
existed
her
now
husband's
to
needs
serve her
and
husband's
produce his
needs
children.
and produce his
The
children.
violence was
The
embedded in the
violence was
structure,
embedded in the structure,
not primarily in individual
acts of brutality. A mainstream historical fact that's been thoroughly established. Rome's legal system, while sophisticated in many ways, was fundamentally designed to concentrate power in male hands and to reduce women to dependence. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Roman law was designed this way. The wedding night rituals were designed this way. They were implementing a system that Rome had consciously chosen. Here's a quirky detail that reveals Rome's mindset. Roman legal thinkers debated whether women were naturally suited to legal autonomy or whether they needed male guardianship. The debate itself is revealing. The assumption wasn't that women should have autonomy and then arguing whether they did. The assumption was that men should have authority and then debating whether women were capable of autonomy.
The burden of proof
was on those arguing for women's rights, not on those arguing for male authority. Historians still argue about whether Roman women had more agency and power than the legal codes suggest, whether some women managed to exercise influence despite legal limitations, whether the formal law masked a more complex reality. Some scholars argue for hidden transcripts, ways that women resisted, that they exercised power despite legal constraints. Others argue that the legal constraints
Others
were real,
argue that the
and
legal
that women's
constraints
agency
were real,
was
and
genuinely
that
limited
women's
by them.
agency was
The debate
genuinely
reflects
limited by them.
uncertainty about how much the
debate
formal legal
reflects
system
uncertainty
determined
about
actual
how
lived
much the formal
experience.
legal system
What
determines
seems
actual
likely
lived
is that there was
experience.
variation.
What
Some
seems
women
likely
probably
is
were
that
able
there
to
was
exercise more
variation.
agency,
Some women
more
probably
influence,
were able
more
to
power than
exercise
the
more
law
agency,
technically allowed
more
them.
influence,
Other women
more
probably
power
experienced
than the
the
law
full
technically
force of
allowed
legal
them.
constraints.
Other women
But the
probably
legal
experienced
framework was
the full
real.
force
It
of
created
legal
possibilities for
constraints.
some women
But the
and
legal
constraints for
framework
others.
was real.
It made
created
certain things
possibilities
possible
for some
and
women
certain things
and
impossible.
constraints for others.
The wedding night,
It
in
made
this
certain
context,
things possible
is
and
where the
certain
legal
things
reality
impossible.
became most
The
concrete.
wedding night, in
It was
this
the moment when the
context,
bride's
is where
legal
the legal
status
reality
changed,
became
when
most
her body
concrete.
became legally
It was
her
the
husband's,
moment when the bride's
when her
legal
autonomy
status
ended
changed,
and her
when her
dependence
body
began.
became legally
The
her
rituals made
husband's,
this legal
when her
reality
autonomy
visceral
ended
and
and her
visible.
dependence began.
They made sure everyone understood what had happened. They made sure the bride understood what her new status meant. And that's perhaps the final revelation. The wedding night wasn't just about sex. It was about power. It was about establishing that the groom had authority over the bride, that the bride had obligations to the groom, that the state was interested in ensuring that this authority was exercised and this obligation was fulfilled. The bedroom was where legal authority became intimate, where political power became physical, where the abstract machinery of Roman law became embodied in two human beings. Looking back at Rome from the modern world, you might think that we've moved beyond all of this, that we've rejected the legal frameworks that made wives into property, that we've established consent as a principle that can't be violated, that we've recognized women as autonomous beings with rights. And in many ways, we have. But the wedding night persists as a concept. The bride still gets displayed in special clothing. The groom still has cultural authority in the bedroom. The wedding night still carries weight and significance that ordinary sex doesn't. The assumption that the wedding night is somehow different, somehow more significant, somehow more binding, that assumption persists, carrying with it the echoes of Rome's legal framework. Understanding the Roman wedding night isn't just historical curiosity. It's understanding the foundations of assumptions that still shape how we think about marriage, about gender, about sexuality, about the body. It's understanding that these assumptions aren't natural or inevitable. They're constructed. They were created by a specific civilization for specific purposes. And if they were created, they can be deconstructed. The wedding night can be reimagined. Intimacy can be organized differently. But first, we need to understand what Rome built and how deeply its architecture persists. And now, as we reach the end of this journey through the corridors of history, let the pacing slow. Let your breathing deepen. The lights are dimmer now, and the weight of what you've learned settles gently across your shoulders like a familiar blanket. You've walked through Rome's bedrooms, through its legal chambers, through the lives of brides and grooms whose names are lost, but whose experiences echo across 2,000 years. You've seen how power operates not just through violence, but through ritual, through law, through the normalization of authority until it feels like the natural order of things.
You've understood that history isn't just what happened in grand moments of conquest or political upheaval.
History is also what happened in bedrooms, in the intimate moments when power became personal. But here's the comforting truth beneath all of this: understanding how things were made, how they were constructed, how they were built from choices and decisions, means understanding that they can be unmade. The Roman wedding night existed because Rome chose for it to exist. The legal frameworks, the rituals, the assumptions about women and power and sexuality, these were created by human beings for human purposes. They lasted for centuries because they were embedded in law and culture and religion. But they changed, they evolved, they adapted, and eventually, many of the most egregious elements disappeared. You're lying there now, in the darkness, understanding that history is not destiny. The past doesn't determine the future. It shapes it, constrains it, influences it. But it doesn't determine it. Every generation can look at what was built before them and ask, do we want to keep this? Do we want to change this? Do we want to build something different? The Roman wedding night is gone. The inspection is gone. The absolute legal authority is gone. What remains are echoes, cultural assumptions, lingering frameworks that shape how we think about intimacy and marriage without us always recognizing where they came from. But once you know where they came from, once you understand the history, you can engage with them consciously rather than just accepting them as natural.
Let that knowledge settle into your mind now, gently, like sleep itself approaching. You've learned something tonight about Rome, about history, about power.
And you've learned something about the difference between accepting things as inevitable and understanding them as constructed, changeable, subject to reimagining.
Close your eyes.